Good afternoon. We will continue with our reading on the book of Romans. Okay, this is entitled Simple Messages on Romans by Harold S. Martin. Okay, I'm reading from this book and I'm reading this in connection with our weekly Bible study on the book of Romans. We are now in page 28 and I will be reading pages 28 up to 32. We are reading the continuation of chapter 2, The Jewish World Condemned. We are now in point 2, Man's Obligation is Obedience, chapter 2, verses 12 to 16 of the book of Romans. All men are obligated to be obedient to the light that they have. God is going to judge men on the basis of the opportunities they have to know the truth. Those who have obeyed what little light they've had, even though it may not have been the full light of the gospel, will fare better on the judgment day than those who have had more light but ignored it. Men will be judged according to the way they have lived in view of the light they have. In verse 12, Paul says there are two distinct groups of mankind, those without law and those under the law. Some men have lived here on earth and made their eternal choice apart from any knowledge of the written law of God. Others have made their eternal choice with full knowledge of the written law of God. The latter part of verse 12 and verse 13 say that the standard of judgment for the Jew will be the law of Moses. And verses 14 and 15 say that the standard of judgment for the heathen Gentiles will be the law of conscience. In other words, God takes into consideration the differing situations into which men have been placed here in this life. God's judgment will be absolutely fair. The first chapters of Romans show that both Jews and Gentiles are guilty before God. The Jews who had the law of Moses and knew God's will disobeyed it, and therefore they are guilty. The Gentiles never had the law of Moses, but they rejected the light of conscience which God did give to them. And so they too are guilty. Therefore, both Jew and non-Jew fall under the condemnation of God and are without excuse. Romans chapter 2 verse 16 says that God will judge even the hidden things of our hearts. If man can pierce through distant clouds with his radar equipment and find minerals beneath the surface of the ground with a Geiger counter, we must never think that the Creator cannot see into the innermost secrets of our beings. There is a day coming when God will judge the secrets of men. His judgment will be based on what a man really is deep down within, not on what he seems to be on the outside. Point 3. Empty possession, empty profession is useless. Chapter 2 verses 17 to 29 of the book of Romans. Paul refers in the final section of chapter 2 to two things in which the Jews prided themselves especially much, the law and also circumcision. But he says they neither obeyed the law nor were they really circumcised in heart. So all this only adds to their guilt before God. Look first at the law. God says, you know the law and you teach it to others, but you yourselves don't obey it. The Jews boasted of a superior standing with God, but their lives contradicted their profession. One of these specific inconsistencies centered around stealing. Thou that preachest a man should not steal, dost thou steal? Verse 21. Throughout the ancient world, the Jew was looked upon as a thief. He used every device imaginable to get a few extra pennies from his customers in order to fill his own pockets. In the book of Hosea, chapter 12, verse 7, this was paraphrased, says, "My people are like crafty merchants selling from dishonest scales. They love to cheat. They taught others not to steal, yet many times they themselves are crooks." Josephus tells about 4 Jews who persuaded a wealthy Roman convert to make a huge contribution to the temple at Jerusalem. But then they appropriated the money for their own use. This kind of incident brought disrepute upon the Jews and upon the God they worship. We too find it easy to preach against stealing and at the same time work shady deals in business or steal time from an employer by loafing on the job or rob another man's character by careless gossip. And thus we are just as guilty before God of stealing as the man who robs a bank or breaks into a school building. Paul says in verse 22 that the Jews were inconsistent not only in the matter of stealing, but also in matters of immorality and idolatry. The Jews had more light and more privileges than the Gentiles, yet they disobeyed God and failed to practice what they preach. And to make it worse, others were blaspheming the name of God because of their hypocrisy and their inconsistencies. Verse 24. The Jews possess the law, but they are guilty before God because they failed to keep it. Look now at the second thing in which the Jews prided themselves, circumcision. Beginning at verse 25, Paul deals with the rite of circumcision, the last Jewish stronghold. The Jews regarded circumcision as in some way securing salvation. Their rabbis said the circumcision saves from hell. They emphasized the outer form but ignored the inner reality. They had the external rite but not the thing for which it stood. Paul punctured their balloon in these verses and reminded them that while they were outwardly circumcised, they had not been cut from sin and united to God. True circumcision is more than a mere cutting of the flesh. It is a covenant of the heart. Jeremiah went to the root of the matter when he urged Israel to circumcise the foreskin of your hearts. Jeremiah chapter 4 verse 4. Circumcision was a symbol of separation from the heathen world and of consecration to a holy God. It was a sign of cutting off everything that was offensive to God. It was a sign of purity of life, but the outward form demands an inner reality because God desires truth in the inward parts. Merely observing outward forms can never make up for our unclean living in our daily lives, and thus a religious rite or ordinance is worthless unless it is accompanied by real faith and good living. The same thing can be said about baptism and feet washing and the holy kiss. These practices are important and they are profitable, but only if accompanied by the inner reality. Verses 28 and 29 clearly state that unless a rite is coupled with real faith and good living, it is only an empty form and will not save a man from judgment. The Jews piously observed the rite of circumcision, but still they were under the wrath of God. In the first 8 verses of Romans chapter 3, Paul imagines an objector raising some questions, and then he gives an immediate answer to the questions. The objector says in verse 1, "You've been saying that there is no difference between the Gentile and the Jew. Both alike are sinful. Then what advantage does the Jew have? Why did God ever bother with the Jewish nation?" Paul answers in verse 2 that while God has not excused their sins, the Jews have enjoyed a real advantage. It was through the Jewish nation that God gave us the scriptures. But the objector says in verse 3, some of the Jews disobeyed the scriptures and were unfaithful to God. That this means that God will break his promise and withhold his blessings from the Jewish nation? The answer comes in verse 4. God always keeps his promises, and we will see in chapter 11 that God is going to keep his promises regarding Israel's future. The objector continues in verse 5, but if our disobedience gives God an opportunity to demonstrate his righteousness, then our sin is really a good thing, isn't it? It gives God a chance to show how good he is. Paul says in verses 6 and 8 that this is a twisted argument. To reason like this would mean that the vilest sinner makes the best saint, because God would have a greater chance to show his mercy. The fact is, God says in verse 9, both Jews and Gentiles are universally sinful. None of us must ever do evil, hoping that eventually good might come out of it. Romans chapter 2 verse 1 up to chapter 3 verse 9 should be a warning to every person who puts his trust in religion and thinks that observing rules and regulation will merit his salvation. That sin is much broader than committing such offenses as murder and adultery and theft. Sometimes those brought up in pious Christian homes fail to see that their hearts are desperately wicked. One may never have committed the outward act of murder, but certainly he spoke words that were intended to slay. He may never have committed the outward act of adultery, but certainly his imagination was not always clean. Paul has gone into much detail in these verses to show that we are all guilty before God, and thus, unless we find some way of escape, we are going to be doomed forever. In later chapters of Romans, we will see that there is only one remedy for sin. Water and soap can wash away dirt. Education can eliminate ignorance. Hard work is the remedy for idleness, but it is only the blood of Jesus Christ that will cleanse from all sin. We will stop here and we'll continue next time on chapter 3, page 33. God bless everyone.